What is the best condition to use a sacrificial anode? Select the three best answers. So our choices are aluminum anode on an aluminum pontoon dock in a freshwater lake, where the dock has an aluminum oxide coating, copper roof affixed with steel nails in a rainy environment with the sacrificial anode in contact with the top of the roof, copper roof affixed with steel nails in an arid environment with the sacrificial anode in contact with the bottom of the roof, soldered copper low sloped, what we colloquially call a flat roof, over steel trusses near the ocean with the sacrificial anode in contact with the top of the roof, steel hot water heater tank served by copper pipes with the sacrificial anode in contact with the inside of the tank, underground steel tank holding non-corrosive chemicals and a sacrificial anode connected by wire to the outside of the tank. All right, this is the answers. Oh, the first one's also correct. There we go. All right, so the first one is also correct. So the first one, which is not bolded, but should be, and the last two are the correct answers. And my guess is most of you guys did not get that one right. So A, E, and F are right. All right, so what is going on here? Well, this is a topic that you guys, if you've been around 40 minutes of competence, if you've been around studying for the exams, if you've taken some of the exams, or if you have taken Amber Book, you know that this idea of metal corrosion is simultaneously a favorite of the study materials and NCARB, but also really, really complex. And so it's been the topic, my guess is it's been the topic of more 40 minutes of competence than anything except for maybe vapor control, which is the other super complex issue that vexes and frustrates architects studying for these exams. Anyhow, if you have been around them, you know that there's kind of a galvanic series, that there's a series of metals, and some are what we call passive, and some are what we call active, some are what we call anodes, and some are what we call cathodes. Now, I need you guys to just kind of memorize. There's not a whole lot of memorization anymore, but I think it's probably worth in the exam, but it's probably worth just memorizing this. So what we want to do is we want to say, okay, everything, and to be super frustrating, when you go online or you go on, you see the list, sometimes the anodes are at the top and sometimes the cathodes are at the top. But in this particular case, the cathodes are at the top and the anodes are at the bottom, and just kind of take it in. Now, in general, I don't want you to worry about all these materials like lead, which we don't generally use in buildings for obvious reasons, and cadmium, it's not a very common building material. I would focus just on zinc and aluminum and copper. So I would focus just on zinc and aluminum and copper on, so zinc and aluminum on one end, copper on the other, and steel in between. So there's other examples of lists we'll get into later. Actually, let's talk about this a little bit more. So on the anode side, we have, let me change my, on the anode side, we have zinc and aluminum. And on the cathode side, we have copper. Most of your questions about metal and corrosion are going to involve those, and then in the middle we have steel. All right, now the cathode is positive. See it right there. So cathodes are positive. You're just going to have to memorize this and really kind of get it in your head, because it's going to be hard to follow everything I talk about after this, although I'll go nice and slow. And anodes are negative. And most probably importantly for our discussion today, anodes, when they're in contact with cathodes, and this is something, again, if you've been studying, you have a sense of, anodes like zinc and aluminum, when they're in contact with cathodes like copper, give their material over to the cathode. So eventually the anode, or the negative side, the side with the electrons it's given up, are going to give its material and it's going to corrode. So the anode is going to corrode. I don't know if corrode, if that's how you spell corrode, but the anode is going to corrode because it's going to be giving its material to the cathode. Now, none of this works. None of this is going to happen unless there's something called an electrolyte in between. But for purposes of architecture and most applications, we're just going to call the electrolyte water. So all this happens in the presence of water. So if you have two dissimilar metals, if you have a copper roof being affixed with steel nails, then the steel is going to give its material to the copper, but it's only going to do that in the presence of water, which happens, of course, when it rains. So if you have a dry climate, if you're in New Mexico or Arizona or other arid locations, that's going to take a long time before one wears away. But that's the anode, that's the negative, that's the one that's going to corrode in the presence of water. So get that in your head, and we'll revisit it a few times because it is really, really hard to remember. So kind of in terms of the sacrificial anode, which is what we're going to talk about today, it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's the idea that all these things are relative. So if you have two metals that are on different parts of this list, and there are other lists that include other types of metals, but if there are two metals on other opposite parts of the list, or even adjacent, like zinc and steel aren't that far away, in the presence of water, especially salt water, which we're going to see in a minute, the zinc as the anode and negative and corroding one will start to deteriorate as the circuit is actually created. It's really a circuit. It's like, it's as much as like 2 volts, although typically it's more like 1/3 of a volt. But if you think of a 9-volt battery, it's not like you can, sink a steel a drum in the ocean and then start running, flashlights off of it. But it's not a small amount of voltage. It's actually a kind of a medium amount of voltage. And voltage, you'll remember, is how much the electrons are being pushed in a circuit. So if we have a ship, we have typically, or often in this case, a bronze propeller. Why do we make our propellers out of bronze? They're sturdy and they're easy to form. So we can make really cool shapes like an efficient propeller shape out of bronze. So this is bronze. But the hull is made out of steel. Why do we make our hull out of steel? Why not just make the whole thing out of bronze so that they're the same metal on the cathodic table or series? Well, because bronze is super expensive. So steel is plenty strong enough and it's shapeable enough to make the compound curve of a hull, but it doesn't cast into shapes as cleanly as the bronze. So now we have steel and bronze, which are in different parts of the cathodic series. And so the steel, if left to its own devices, is going to give its material to the bronze. So steel is giving its material to the bronze. And the electrolyte, the water, is the salt water, and salt water makes for a really good electrolyte. So it's really efficient. So the steel wants to give its material, and so what you'll have corrosion on the steel, and eventually you'll have a hole in the boat. So we don't want a hole in the boat. We prefer not to have that. So because it's electricity, and because electricity is magic, what we're going to do is, and by magic I mean it's just weird. Like it kind of obeys some of the normal laws that we see that we can kind of imagine with the analogies I grapple with. But some of it's kind of just magic. So if we had something that was on the other side of steel on that list, and on the anodic side, so the bronze is a cathode. Steel is in the middle of the list, but in this case, it's the anode. So what we want to do is we want to instead, if we can attach another metal, let's say zinc or aluminum, because the way to remember it is A to Z. That's how I remember it. A to Z is on one side, and then copper is on the other. So aluminum and zinc on one side, copper on the other, steel in the middle, A to Z. So in this case, bronze is on the copper side, steel is in the middle. And if we can put something on the other side, on the anodic side, on the anode side, on the aluminum zinc side, on the electrically negative side, if we can attach it to the hull, just a little clump of it, if we can just attach a little clump of it, then what'll happen is the steel will no longer be the anode, because the zinc that we plopped on, or the aluminum that we plopped on the hull, the electrons are now going to move from the aluminum to the ship's steel hull, and then they're going to go to the bronze. And so instead of the ship's steel hull corroding, the aluminum sacrificial anode will corrode. That's why it's called a sacrificial anode. It sacrifices itself so that something else doesn't have to. It's really kind of elegant and clumsy at the same time. And so what does that look like in practice? Well, in this case, this is actually the opposite. This one is an aluminum rudder. So it's not as strong as the bronze, but it's also castable. And again, we have a steel hull of the ship. So in this case, this is our sacrificial anode. And our sacrificial anode in this case has a wire that goes to the aluminum, because it doesn't have to necessarily, the sacrificial anode doesn't necessarily have to be attached to the thing that it's sacrificing for. It could be connected with a wire, because a wire can move the electrons and make the whole thing work. So like I said, it's a little bit magic, but what's happening is this is corroding ostensibly instead of this, but this is corroding too. Now, why would this be corroding? Why would the aluminum be corroding if the sacrificial anode is connected to the aluminum? Go ahead and put your answer on the chat. Just take a guess. So the reason that it's corroding, my guess is, it's not my photo, the reason that it's corroding is the reason that this Adobe stock photo is corroding is one of two things, I speculate. Either this connection's not good or wasn't good at some point, so it wasn't protecting it because the wire's connection wasn't good, or maybe there was a aluminum oxide that kind of formed on the and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but maybe there was aluminum oxide that formed on the rudder that acted as an insulator that kept this wire from making contact with it. Or maybe the sacrificial anode itself, it's more like the sacrificial anode is sacrificial. It's like a water filter in your refrigerator, or like a filter in your humidifier or whatever. It has to be replaced. And so there could have been a couple of years where this thing was already gone, and because it corrodes and it eventually goes away, and it was connected, and but there was nothing to sacrifice. And so the aluminum rudder was actually sacrificing itself, because there was not magnesium here, which is even farther on the anodic side than aluminum. There was not magnesium to sacrifice itself for the aluminum. There wasn't any. So someone maybe for a few years did not replace it. So this is one of the downsides. This is one of the downsides of sacrificial anodes, is that you have to replace them. They sacrifice themselves, and then there's no one anymore. I'm not sure how often you have to replace them. It depends on how big a thing there is, and how big the sacrificial anode is, and how big the metal are, and how close they are, and what the electrolyte is, and so forth. But every so often you have to inspect it, and then when you've seen that it's sufficiently corroded, you have to replace it with another one. All right, so this is what they look like when they're doing their job right. So this is a piece of zinc or aluminum or magnesium, the kind of anodic, the anode side, the A to Z, the aluminum to zinc, the negative side, attached to a steel hull of a boat. And the idea is that these things are going to pit so that this won't. Likewise, here, again, we have the sacrificial anode attached to a hull of a boat. And likewise here, we have the sacrificial anode right here, attached to, in this case, the rudder of a boat, it looks like. And sometimes there are collar. So it could be on a piece of pipe. Certainly, there doesn't always necessarily have to be, in saltwater especially, or underground, there doesn't always have to be two different pieces of metal because, well, for several reasons. One is there are minerals inside the saltwater itself, so, and freshwater too, but less so. So even if you only have one metal under the water there, the process can still happen. It just happens to the saltwater, and or there may be other metals down here, and or steel, because it's an alloy, has a bunch of different metals in it. So one area of steel may be anodic relative to another area of steel, just because, you know, we didn't mix the batter as well as we possibly could have, and it's maybe impossible to mix it totally. So what we want to do is what we're going to do here is we're going to put oftentimes in these kind of situations, especially in saltwater, if we have metal, we're going to put a sacrificial anode, and we're going to either attach it with a wire to the thing that's submerged, or we're going to attach it just directly by applying it, just so it's in contact. And if you go online, there's all kinds of other if you do a galvanic series in Google, you'll see a million different things. But again, you want to focus, now in this case, the aluminum and zinc, the A to Z, the negative, the anode is on the top of the list, and the copper is near to the bottom. And as before, we have steel in the middle. And so if we have two different metals in contact with an electrolyte, we'll call it water, especially salt water, but it happens with fresh water too. And it happens with just water underground that's just in the earth. And those metals are the farther away they are, the faster this process works. The more often they're wet, the faster this process works. And you can see it again and again. Again, and this is another one I got online. So, all right, now let's go through each of the answers so you can kind of follow along here. All right, the first one we're going to skip for later, because in some ways it's the exception that proves the rule, because we have aluminum and aluminum. And so why would you need aluminum for aluminum? We'll get to that in a little bit. The second one and the third one and the fourth one are all copper roofs, and we don't have a good use. I mean, theoretically, I guess it could be used, but we don't have a good application when there's a copper roof and steel nails. And the reason is because copper is here and steel is here. And this is, well, actually, you decide. Just tell yourself, or you can put it in the chat. Is the anode side down at the bottom of this list, or is it the top? The anode is the negative side. Go ahead and put it in the chat. Yeah, it's at the bottom. So the bottom gives to the top. So the bottom gives to so the steel fasteners are going to give to the copper roof. And we can't realistically attach a sacrificial anode to each steel fastener. There's, you know, thousands on a roof. We could theoretically put it on the roof, but it wouldn't really help with the steel fastener. So we need to make something, we need to use zinc, aluminum, magnesium and attach it to the steel like we did with the ship, but it's impossible when you have steel fasteners and a copper roof. So all three of these don't work in the presence of a copper roof because you would be giving a sacrificial anode to the metal that's actually taking in the material, not to the one that's giving it up. So it's not actually a sacrificial anode at all. All right, so that explains these three and why they're wrong. Now the next one is a steel hot water heater tank served by copper pipes with the sacrificial anode in contact with the inside of the tank. So our steel hot water heater tanks are steel because steel is stronger than copper. Copper is more malleable. And so, but our pipes are often copper because they're more malleable. So, and there's water involved because it's a hot water heater. So you have, in a hot water heater, you have steel tank, you have water, and you have copper pipes. Well, what's going to happen is the steel is going to want to give its material as a more anodic one, the more negative one is going to want to give its it's going to pit. It's going to corrode, and you don't want a hot water heater. Anyone ever had a hot water heater bust on them tank and the water goes everywhere? That's a really bad situation. That's one of the reasons we don't put hot water heaters, if we can help it, in places where if there was eventually a leak, a big leak, it would cause real damage. We often put them in places like basements and garages. But one of the ways it will corrode is because it's giving its material to the it's an anode, and it's giving its material to the copper pipes that are in it. That's the cathode. And so what we need to do is we need to give it a sacrificial anode, and it's actually just a rod. This is what it looks like after it's kind of worn down. So this is what it looks like when it's probably about time to change it because it's about to break. This is another one that's pitted. So this is what a sacrificial anode looks like in your house if you have a hot water heater. These are all sacrificial anodes that are all, on their way out. Thought I had one that was new. Well, anyhow, when they're new, they're like this, but shiny. I thought I had an image of it. Maybe it'll come up later. So, so every so often you have to put them in. Now, I'm not so sure how often you have to put them in. Every 5 years? 3 to 5 years. 3 to 5 years. So you guys need to go check this out. Every 3 to 5 years, you should be doing it. So you guys who are homeowners need to replace these because you need a sacrificial anode. So all right. So that's the steel. That's a steel hot water heater tank. So that's why it's a correct answer. We need a sacrificial anode in that. And so if you see a pattern, it's things that are submerged are the ones where it's usually most useful, because those are the things where you just have a lot of electrons moving. If it's a roof or something that just, a hinge or some piece of hardware that happens to get wet once in a while, it's usually not as much of an issue. But if it's something that's submerged, that's where the benefit really comes into play. All right. So our last one here on the bottom is an underground steel tank holding non-corrosive chemicals. It actually doesn't really matter that it's holding non-corrosive chemicals because water is an electrolyte, and a sacrificial anode connected by a wire to the outside of the tank. So now we have in section, we have the earth, we have a buried tank, and we have, let's call it zinc. We have like a big packet of zinc that's connected by a wire to the outside of the tank. As long as it's making contact with the metal, it really doesn't matter if it's in the inside of the tank, on the outside of the tank, affixed to it, or a wire, as long as it's making contact. And so we have water underground because, well, it's underground. So there's water here, and there's minerals underground. Some of those minerals are going to be cathodic. So some of them are going to be relative to steel, the steel tank. Some of them are the minerals that are underground are going to be cathodic. So they'll be like copper underground or something like that. And so the steel tank is going to corrode because it's going to give its material through the water to the minerals in the ground. But instead, because we have a big hunk of zinc here, the zinc is going to pit and it's going to move over. So you can see the advantages of this. It protects it pretty well. It seems to do a good job. It's time tested. It's super cheap to do, but you can see the disadvantages. You have to inspect it to make sure it hasn't run out. Now that leaves us with the most confusing one. It's kind of the exception that proves the rule. Aluminum is a bit special because whenever aluminum, here's our underground tank, right? So if it was a steel tank and it was underground, we could attach a sacrificial anode to it, and that sacrificial anode that's welded to the steel tank, if it's underwater or underground, especially if it's underwater, is going to help save the steel tank or save just the way it saves the hull of the ship. So now, if we're talking about, in this case, aluminum. So we have an aluminum pontoon dock. So this dock is floating on pontoons, so it's basically floating on aluminum bladders. And so that aluminum is submerged underwater. Now, aluminum is kind of special in that it oxidizes. And so what happens is if aluminum, pretty much within a few minutes of being exposed to air, most aluminums, unless we treat it specially, most aluminums will oxidize. And the oxidation process is like it then provides a protection for future. And this is something that shows up not just in, this idea of aluminum oxidation is something that also shows up in the exam, somewhat separate from the idea of corrosion, but it's somewhat related to. So the aluminum, in this case, the aluminum pontoons are going to, once they're exposed to air, which they obviously are, after manufacturing and transport, and certainly here in situ, once they're exposed to air for just a few minutes, there's like a coating that forms on the aluminum. It's kind of what makes aluminum dull when you see it, and that coating then acts as an insulator, and that's why if you've taken Amber Book, you know that regular homeowners aren't supposed to mess with aluminum wires, because when we strip the wire in our house, the wire gets that coating, and then that coating becomes a resistor, and that resistor can, in some rare cases, heat up and even cause a fire. So only electricians are supposed to be dealing with aluminum wires. But if aluminum is really cheap, we have copper clad aluminum. The copper wires don't have this issue, but aluminum has a special issue where it oxidizes, and when it oxidizes, then we need to then have an anode. There's that layer that protects it, and then we need to have an anode that's aluminum. In this case, it doesn't have to be aluminum, it could be magnesium or zinc probably, but we have to get something on the anode side of it so that the pontoon itself doesn't corrode. Now this is super complicated, so this one is where I get even probably a little bit more difficult than the actual exam would, but not by much. And they definitely do cover aluminum oxidation, and they definitely cover all kinds of galvanic corrosion. I think not because it's that common in architecture, but because it's really easy to test on, and it's kind of complicated. So if they want to make a hard question, it's a good one to use. So anyhow, what we can do in practice is we often, like in the back of your iPad, we will purposely oxidize the aluminum in a controlled, by putting it in a special chemical bath. We'll, do a controlled oxidation of the aluminum. But in the case of a pontoon boat, it's just going to happen anyway, and it's just going to get that kind of dull sheen to it. So what we can do is we can use a special aluminum alloy that does not oxidize, and we can attach it to the aluminum pontoon that has oxidized, and then the seawater will, instead of taking the material and pitting the material that is the pontoon until it pops or corrodes or gets a hole in it, it will take it from the sacrificial anode. As long as we keep replacing it, hopefully we'll be okay. Now, here's my next question. And I'm not sure NCARB, I think, is tinkering with stainless steel. Where is stainless steel on this list? One of the lists I showed you before did have stainless steel on it. I don't know if you picked up on it, but where is stainless steel on this list, just relative to the ones we care about, A to Z, aluminum, zinc, steel, and copper? Where is stainless steel? Go ahead and put it on the chat. Tell me it's between which two. So someone said by copper, someone said between zinc and steel, someone said between copper and silver, closer to platinum, below copper. So the answer is it depends. It depends. So sometimes you have stainless steel here and here, down by copper. That's called active stainless steel. So some lists you'll see it down here, and I'm not sure if NCARB knows this or not. But other times you realize that stainless steel is a recipe, and it's got all kinds of alloys. It has magnesium and nickel and all kinds of other metals that we never see in day-to-day life, cadmium or whatever. And so depending on, and there are standards, as you might imagine, for chromium in this case. This one's 13% chromium. And so it depends on the recipe of the stainless steel. It depends on what the batter is made from. So we have some of it that is type 304, type 316, type 410, active type of 304. So we have both active stainless steel, which is up by zinc and aluminum, and we have passive stainless steel that's down on the other side of copper. So with stainless steel, it really depends. And so hopefully, if you've got a question with stainless steel, it would specify that it's active or passive. If you do find one that does not specify, I really encourage you to reach out to NCARB. Great news, I got an email this week. NCARB hired a guy whose job it is to just look over the questions and do some research and just the kind of basic being a human expert. So they hired a guy who just recently got licensed and who seems very eager to kind of research this stuff, to check on this stuff. So I think that and his first order of business is to fix the one that we can all pick on them for, the one that we can see, the practice exams. Now, it's a little unfair to compare the practice exam questions with the real questions, because the practice exam questions that NCARB put out have not gone through the dummy process where they put them out there in the wild and they see how test takers react to them. So they're going to go through those first, but then they're going to go through the actual real questions. Anyhow, so stainless steel is all over the place. Sometimes it's here, sometimes it's here. It's all over the place depending on whether it's active or passive. Now all of this is Galvani, and he's on the Italian banknote of some kind. Luigi Galvani was all these guys were kind of the pioneers of electricity, were like late 1700s, early 1800s. And then, of course, Edison was late 1800s, but Galvani and he was kind of contemporaries, maybe a little bit before Volta, and then Faraday maybe came a little bit after that. But Galvani taught someone who taught Volta. But Galvani was interested in like bioelectricity. He would that's why we call it the galvanic action. You know, he would galvanize steel or whatever. He would mess around with like electrifying dead frogs' muscles, and they would twitch. And he was like, "Huh, there's electricity involved. This is so cool." And then we just kind of basically everything I described, the idea that there's an electrolyte and that there's copper and that there's aluminum, that's just a battery. So it seems like magic, but you use it all the time. So there's electrolyte in there. There's a positive terminal. The positive side is the cathode. The negative side is the anode. And there's a chemical in between. And when we connect the circuit to a light bulb, to your flashlight, and then back around, we're just sending the electrons around and around until eventually the negative side, the anode, is worn out. There's nothing left of nothing, doesn't have any electrons to give. And so it's exactly the process that we're talking about, whether it be a car battery or a dry cell battery like we use. And actually, right now, I think as we look at the energy grid and we're starting to move towards finally, it's attributed to Winston Churchill, but it actually probably came from someone else. But he said, America always does the right thing after she's exhausted all other possibilities and alternatives. So we have finally exhausted all other alternatives, and we are finally, with the legislation that passed recently, going to be moving to a renewable energy source. And that renewable energy source, of course, is going to be primarily, at least at the beginning, wind and solar, and maybe some carbon-free nuclear, which nuclear is carbon free. It drives me crazy that the environmental movement has turned against nuclear and won't turn back. But anyhow, because it is carbon free. But anyhow, I think actually after that happens, kind of the next wave after that is going to be batteries, right? This is not me magically deciding this. This is what the experts say. But so we're going to have kind of utility scale batteries, because we not only need to produce electricity, but we need to make sure there's electricity available for people when there's no sun shining and there's no wind blowing. So we have to be able to store it. And battery technology has not really advanced that much in the last 100 years or so. But we just, we're just keep putting money in it, and we're going to figure it out. And so batteries will be the next thing, because there's no one more angry than an American who doesn't have electricity, even for a really short amount of time. We really go nuts about that stuff. All right. Good night. Get licensed.